Okay, good morning. We're going to continue. I'm going to keep my word. We're going to continue. We're going to talk about the Steinsaltz edition, the Steinsaltz translation. It's a little different. It's a little bit of a different kind of sugya today, more of like I guess a hashkafa type of sugya than the usual. But let's try to go through it. So just by way of introduction, Rabbi Adin Even Yisrael Steinsaltz. He changed his name at some point, his last name, from Steinsaltz to Even Yisrael. He like Israelified it. Was born in Yerushalayim in the 1930s, I think. I think his parents were Russian, first generation Russian Olim. I don't think his parents were from at all. He was born in a totally not religious family. Eventually, he was brilliant. He was a very, very smart man, very clever. And during his teens, he started learning. He learned a lot of Torah. He also learned a lot of secular studies. He was very well versed in both fields. As a young adult, he became fully frum, and then by 28 years old, he started his project of translating the whole Shas, which is a pretty serious undertaking to take. I think it's a young man's type of dream to translate the whole Shas. At 28, he starts it in 1960 something. He didn't complete it until like maybe deep into the 80s. It was like a 45-year project. I think he did most of it himself. He had helpers, but he did most of it himself. Now what he did is he translated all of Shas into Hebrew, like Ivrit. He took it from the Lashon that Gemara is written in Aramaic, and he translated it into like a more readable Ivrit for the Israeli consumer. Now what he did is he also rearranged the Tzur Sadaf. If you've ever seen one, I'm sure a lot of people have seen it. He moved things around. Rashi and Taisvus got moved. He put his pirush on the side. He had two pirushim, like a pirush katzer, like just taich, mamish, like the words in Hebrew, and then he had a pirush aruch, and then he also has like sidebars. Sidebars were like to discuss botanical, scientific, historical, any like little sidebar that you could go into like in a little more detail. That's something that needs like a little more of iyun, would be like a sidebar on the bottom. There was actually pictures in his Gemaras, which was interesting. He had Nekudis in his Gemaras. He transliterated hard Aramaic words to teach like a beginner how to read these words, like where the punctuation, how to read it. So it was actually a very, very useful tool that he made for people learning Gemara. And over many, many, many years, he put out the whole thing. Now, in the 1980s, when it became like a fully completed project, and they opened like a Steinsaltz Institute, and they were ready to translate it into many other languages. I think today it's like in English, Russian, French, Spanish. I don't know. I don't know if the whole Shas, but good parts of it are in many, many languages. He became like an international celebrity. He won the Bialik Prize, the Tel Aviv Prize, the Pras Yisrael, every prize, like literary prize you could win in Israel. He didn't show up to all of these award ceremonies, which was controversial in its own right. Sometimes he missed them. And then also he came on the radar of the Gedolim in Eretz Yisrael, and they developed the whole controversy about Steinsaltz. Now before that, I just want to say, on his Gemara, and in some versions of it, it's not on every single one of them, in some versions of it, there is a haskama from a very, very well-known gadol from America who gave haskama to Steinsaltz the Shas. I don't know if it was like a haskama or it was just the letter that he wrote him, but Moshe Feinstein, in two different letters, gives Steinsaltz, Rabbi Steinsaltz, haskama on the Gemara. He also has haskama from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, obviously. He was a Lubavitcher Chassid, pretty serious Lubavitcher Chassid. Reb Moshe in his Haskamas writes that he didn't look through the pirush, in a big way, but the new pirush that he wrote, which includes this new pirush katzer that he wrote, which is like a summary of the halachas that are discussed and etc., is an outstanding work, and it could benefit those who are not familiar with the Talmud. And even those who are familiar, it could help them, and whatever. And Moshe gives them a bracha. And then Moshe separately, in an unpublished one, writes that it's a good pirush, and shuls that have an ilim that could benefit from it would do well purchasing it, like to encourage people to buy it. And this is printed, and not every masechta, like some masechtas have it, some masechtas don't have it. But in some masechtas it has this has come from Moshe, then this has come from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote a few times about it, and some other rabbanim. But Moshe Feinstein gave him haskam, which is a pretty big deal. And this predates the controversy. Moshe Feinstein's haskam, I think, is in like 1960 something or 70 something. No, it's actually 80. The early 1980s, 1983, is when Moshe gave the haskama to the edition of the Steinsaltz. The second one was written a different time. And then the controversy starts a little bit later, like in 1990, like several years later after Moshe was nifter already. Now, the Iker controversy, and we'll see when we go into some of the raid that's written about it, we'll see, is not so directly about translating the Shas, like we've been discussing until now. It's a little bit like adjacent. It's a little bit of a shtickle different controversy. And to set that up, I want to talk about a whole different sugya, a sugya in hashkafa, and then we'll migrate back to the Steinsaltz product and controversy. And that's as follows. In the back of the Emes Liyakiv on Navi, on Chelik Aleph, which is really Chelik Beis, the Emes Liyakiv on Navi was out for years and years, was Chelik Beis. It's like the second half of the Nevi'im. Chelik Aleph, which is like Yeshua Shaftim and Shmuel, is the one that came out much more recently by a different mechaber, not the same mechaber as the first Chelik on Emes Liyakiv on Navi. And in the back there's a few nispachim, there's like a few longer pieces that Rabbi Yaakov gave, drushes that Rabbi Yaakov gave at different places. And there's a drush over here, Nispach Be'inyan Limud Historia, a drush from Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky regarding the sugya of learning history. That's what the topic of this is. Now, the background of this is that I think in 1983, the Torah Masorah Convention had a planetarium, like a discussion between various different contributors about the value of learning history b'chlal and what percentage history should be like the curriculum in yeshivas. Now, the people who participated was Rabbi Yosef Elias. He is a Yakish Yid. He was actually a very interesting story. He was a Yakish, born in Germany before the war in the early 1930s. And in the beginning of the 30s, there was a thing where a bunch of parents sent their children to London to be safe as they saw like the storm clouds gathering. I don't think they realized that it was going to be a massacre. They just thought it was going to be a wartime. And they sent their children to London. And when the war broke out, the British government wasn't sure what to do. They had like thousands or hundreds, I don't know exactly the number, of German children living in Britain, which was not acceptable to them because they could be like a fifth column. They couldn't have a whole horde of Germans living there. So they took them and they sent them to Canada and to Australia, to like the far-flung reaches of the British Empire, so they should be out of the way. Rabbi Yosef Elias and a bunch of other Yiddish kids found themselves in like a DP camp of sorts right outside Toronto during World War II. Rabbi Yaakov was a Rav in Toronto then, at that time, in the 1940s. And Rabbi Yaakov worked very hard to get these kids out of the DP camp. I think there's like a whole story. It's a Rabbi Jervel story from what I remember. It's like I remember this. Rabbi Jervel was my Rebbe in 4th grade. So this is like a story from a long time ago. But I think their papers came through on Shabbos, and Rabbi Elias refused to leave until he got a special heter that he could leave on Shabbos, because if he didn't leave now, maybe the papers wouldn't come through again. I don't remember, there's like some sort of whole story. Now, he was close to Rabbi Yaakov from Toronto years. Later on, he moved to America, became a big mechanech. And Rabbi Yosef Elias is one of the people involved in this discussion. Another one involved in the discussion is Rabbi Rottenberg. There's a sefer called Tildas Am Olam. It's a history book written in Hebrew. I think Art School started translating it now. Maybe they're completed translating it already. It was written in many volumes, 5 or 6, 7 volumes of Tildas Am Olam, history of Klal Yisrael, like Be'enei Chazal, like through Chazal's words, history of Klal Yisrael, Bais Rishon, Bais Sheni, etc. He took part in this debate. And Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, who was from the Gedolei Hadar at the time, he was like going to settle the debate. And each one of them gave like a presentation about the value of history or the not value of history. And Rabbi Yaakov was going to settle it. So this drasha that they have over here in the back is Rabbi Yaakov at the end of the discussion of like a session of a discussion of the value of history. Rabbi Yaakov is going to weigh in and settle it. Now I'm going to do like a live commentary as we go through the Rabbi Yaakov, because there's a lot of things that I want to be moisif, but it's a very shlemistic piece, unlike the hashkaf of learning history. We'll be moisif here in their details. Now just Baifan Akdam, Rabbi Yaakov starts off and he says, Rabbi Rottenberg said, there's a pasuk that says, Char Yimaiselim Binu Shnei Star V'dar, right? A pasuk at the end of the Torah says, Char Yimaiselim Binu Shnei Star V'dar. Rottenberg said, Hilu Sheyesh Kan Mitzvah Saseh. It's like a mitzvah saseh to learn history. It says, Char Yimaiselim Binu Shnei Star V'dar. It's a mitzvah saseh to learn history. He says, L'kach einani maskim. I'm not maskim to that. That's called taking the pasuk out of context. And I've spoken about this many times. He says, you don't take psukim out of context. And the examples he used, he says, if he tells to a Rambam in Igeres Taimon, the Rambam says if you're going to take psukim out of context, you could read a pasuk like this. The pasuk in Devarim says, don't listen to the Navi. So if you just read psukim, how it says, don't listen to Nevi'im. Done, finished. Never supposed to listen to a Navi. Now, obviously, the pasuk is talking about a particular type of Navi. Or the pasuk says, it says you should serve other gods and you should bow down to them. It means you should din avodah zarah. It's before pasuk. He says that Rabbi Yaakov used this as a raya. He says the Rambam in Igeres Taimon is using this to highlight that psukim have a context. You can't take the pasuk out of the context. Take the pasuk out of the context, you lose everything. So he says this that he said that there's a chiv like a mitzvah say to learn history. That's not what the pasuk is talking about. He says the pasuk, if you look at it in the whole in the Torah, the pasuk is talking about Zachar Yisrael Binu Shnei Stavadar Sha'ala Vicha V'Yagedchas Kenacha V'Yayim Rulach B'Hanchel Goyim Elyon B'Afridcha. The whole Langa Megillah where the pasuk says that look back and see that Hashem Klaibdeis Klal Yisrael. Hashem chose Klal Yisrael to be His nation, and He made us His prized nation and pays attention to us and cares about us and etc. And we should realize how important we are, how wichtig Klal Yisrael is in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So he says the context of the pasuk is not at all that there's a mitzvah saseh to learn history. That's not what the pasuk is saying. The pasuk is telling you a totally different lesson. Zachari Ma'aseilam, learn that Klal Yisrael is important to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So he says it has nothing to do with that. Now I want to make a sidebar over here, a little sidebar. Taka, if you look at Chazal and you look at really Chazal are very much not consumed with knowing the history. There's minimal information in regards to major historical events. Things that happened to Klal Yisrael after the Chesimas HaNevi'im, once the Nevi'im stopped being written. There's major historical events that transpired to Klal Yisrael, and there's a very minimal effort on Chazal's part to document it accurately, properly, thoroughly. Chazal say what they say. You could piece it together, a piece here, a piece there, from different midrashim, different gemaras, a Bavli, Yerushalmi, etc. But there's no comprehensive desire or inclination to organize Klal Yisrael, what happened to Klal Yisrael, in any serious and structured way. Chazal are not concerned with history. And this observation, Rav Chaim Ozer, in a letter that he writes, and I want to read you a little bit. Rav Chaim Ozer, in a letter that he writes in Igros, Rav Chaim Ozer writes as follows. He says like this. He says, Gedolei HaTorah me'azumei olam. Gedolei HaTorah from now and forever, leisamu libam lahamik b'yediyas divrei hayam l'bnei Yisrael. They didn't make a big effort to know Klal Yisrael's history. Ach ki lichta b'sefer Talmud gedolei v'chacham yisrael midor dor. They never wrote books documenting Klal Yisrael's history, the history of different Gedolei Yisrael, etc. The words of the Rishonim and Achronim they're lebedik, they're living in the mouths of the Tefsei HaTorah. Kol batei medrash meleim mizan al zan mirabanim v'talmideim haloim dem teres chayim kilu nemru v'nishna yom. Every base medrash is full from wall to wall of Talmidei Chacham who are being Isaac and learning the Divrei HaTorah as if it's still alive, as if it's still going on right now. We don't make memorials or monuments to tzaddikim. Their words are their monument, which is what the Rav Chaim is quoting a Yerushalmi in Shkalim, a famous Yerushalmi that says this. And Rav Chaim says Chazal and Chachmei Yisrael never made a big effort into knowing history. There's a Bakanta member from Baruch Ber. Baruch Ber was once in a wagon with a Talmud Chacham, but a scholar, someone who knew the whole historical background of everything, the context and whatever. And after a conversation, Baruch Ber was a little frustrated, and Baruch Ber told him, "Was geht mich an, was Abaye hat geessen, avu hat gewohnt, avu hat geschlafen. I don't care what Abaye ate, where he lived, where he slept. I know where Abaye is right now. At left nachaltz in middle of the sugya that I'm in the middle of." This is what Baruch Ber told him. Like, it doesn't interest me, b'chlal, where he ate, he slept, he lived. What do I care? I know where he lives right now. He's alive and well right now in my bais medrash. So Chaim Ozer is echoing a very similar, gisha. Then he says, even those Gedolim who knew some history, he says it was Maseim b'derech Mikra, b'derech Agav. They knew a little history along the way. Most of their time, their primary time was dedicated to learning Torah. They picked up a little bit of history along the way. They didn't pay any attention to it. Then just this hergish that Rabbi Yaakov starts off with, that it's not a mitzvah to say to know history, even Klal Yisrael's history. And it's not, when it says Chari Ma'aseilam, it doesn't mean that it's a mitzvah say. It's something that Baruch Ber and Chaim Ozer and many other Gedolim expressed. I'll read you a letter soon from Shimon Schwab, a beautiful letter in English, rather. I think it was written, I don't know what language you wrote in L'chtila, but it's in English. I'll read it for you in English. Maybe it was in German originally, then in English. I don't think it was ever in Lashon Kodesh, so we're safe. It's not a translation. But this is Rav Chaim Ozer says. And then Rav Chaim Ozer continues and he says, but mitkufas yiridas hayadus beretz Ashkenaz yemei reform, when the reform started, kasheba shimshim shel gedolei Yisrael, when the Gedolim's light, got diminished and the Batei Midrashis and the yeshivas were desolate, Ein Talmidim v'leimdim havayis d'Abaye v'Rava. There was no Talmidim learning the havayis of Abaye v'Rava. Ein Torah ve'in Yiras Hashem. Oz hechelu asayfrim hasridim sham lahatziv tziyonim matzevis l'gdolim aris l'maris hadaris. It's then the few remaining remnants of Yiddishkeit started writing over some historical vignettes, some historical documentation, some details so people could know. And he continues on. He says that the Haskalah brought a tremendous amount of idea in history, but it was history with an agenda, history with an angle, history with a particular perspective. And he says, imagine someone who's living Rosh V'Rubai, he says, in an outside world. He's b'chlal not Yiddish, Rosh V'Rubai, but he's going to write over the history of Rabbeinu Hananel, the history of Rabbeinu Nissim, the history of the Rif. It's Kalkulei agenda, it's Kalkulei trying to fit the Rif into his paradigm, into the modern, syntax and the modern prism. Everything there is not keshura. He says, L'davar hazeh samu lev yichidei skula shebedar. So some yichidei skula in the dar turned their attention to this. Echad miyuchad sheyatza chalot zu Baal Deres Yerushalayim was Rechiel Michal Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi, the Baal Deres Yerushalayim. Im yidiyaseh hagdoila v'arachava v'hamuka b'talmud v'noisei kelev heres makara sfiris b'zeh yisay divrei yam l'bnei Yisrael. And he showed some gedolim took the effort to write down a little bit of Klal Yisrael's history. The Deres Yerushalayim did the most comprehensive job to isolate and to prove and to teach the Sridim who remained what Yiddish history was really about, to combat the other streams. Now, what's interesting is I saw referred to, I think Rav Schwab, or actually Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky in this letter refers to Rabbi Chimel the Deres Yerushalayim, the Baal Deres Yerushalayim. He says something interesting. He says it's not a history book; it's an anti-history book. He doesn't write a history. Mitoich dvarav, you come out to history. His tachlis is always to be leichem, to fight this mistake, this machaber, that machaber, this idea. Mitoich dvarim, you come out to like a retelling of history from his perspective. But he says it's not a history book; it's an anti-history book. A very interesting way of being magdir. So this is Rav Chaim Oizer's letter, and I think it very much like sets the table for Rabbi Yaakov's writing. Now, Rabbi Yaakov continues. And he says he wants to highlight a particular. Then he says as follows. He says to tell over Klal Yisrael's history, you have to be a navi. Why? He says because something happens, you think you understand it, you don't really understand. It's 9D chess. It's not. There's so many things, so many moving pieces and parts. So many things mean what you don't think they mean that you have to know so many details of it to understand. And he gives one example. It's a beautiful example, and I want to just share it. I won't read it. I'll tell it over instead. But he gives an example as follows. He says in Shmuel Beis, which was written by God HaChayzeh, Nasan HaNavi, right? Shmuel Beis is the completion of Shmuel HaNavi's work after Shmuel HaNavi was nifter. So the Gemara Babasar brings a machlekes, but Rabbi Yaakov says Nasan HaNavi and God HaChayzeh are the two Nevi'im who wrote the completion of Shmuel Beis, and it says as follows. There's a story that's told, David HaMelech, in Shmuel Beis Perek Tes, when David HaMelech gets to a relative moment of tranquility in his life. David HaMelech's life, if you're back in Shmuel Beis, is one big tumultuous turmoil of war and insurrection and all sorts of problems going on in David Melech's kingdom. At a relative moment of peace and quiet, David Melech in Perek Tes says as follows: says, "Vayomer David, hachiyesh oida shenoisel lebeis Shaul ve'esi mechased bavur Yonasan." David Melech, kayidua, was a very, very close, had a very, very incredibly close relationship with Yonasan ben Shaul, his brother-in-law. And he says, "Is there someone left over to Shaul's household that I could do a kindness to repay the relationship that I had with Yonasan?" And he says as follows. The pasuk says, "Lebeis Shaul Eved." There was one servant left over from the Beis Shaul, who shmoi Tziva. His name was Tziva. Vayikru leil David vayemer Hamelech ilav ha'ata Tziva vayemer avdecha. Yeah, I'm the servant Tziva. It says vayemer Hamelech ha'efes aidish lebeis Shaul. Is there anybody left over? V'asim v'chesed. So it says vayemer lo. So Tziva tells him vayemer Tziva lamelech oid ben liyonasan nechei raglayim. There is one son left over to Yonasan. He's a cripple, a gimp. Vayemer le'amelech eifayhu. Vayemer Tziva lamelech hinehu beis Machir ben Amiel b'loy davar. He's in Machir ben Amiel's homestead. B'loy davar. Now b'loy davar, the Mefarshim tell us, means he's a nobody. He's a nobody. He's not a Talmud Chacham. He's a cripple. He's a nobody. There's somebody left over. He's a nobody. There's somebody left over there. Now it says Vayishalach HaMelech, David Melech sends to get him, and he collects him. And this one srid that was left over was Mephibosheth ben Yonasan. And David Melech collects him, and David Melech tells Mephibosheth, "I want to honor you. I want to give you all the ancestral lands that belong to Shaul." And he tells Tziva, "At the Tziva, you're going to be the administrator of Mephibosheth's estate, so to speak, and I'm giving it all to Mephibosheth." Now the Psukim continue, and Chazal and Brachas Amayach about this more. It turns out that Mephibosheth was incredible. Mephibosheth was, the Gemara in Brachas tells us, "Lo Mephibosheth shmai le'ish b'isha shmai, v'lo menikra Mephibosheth shayamachlim pnei David b'halacha." He would embarrass David Melech in learning. He was so good in learning that David Melech was embarrassed of him. So he was not b'loi davar. He was very much a somebody. He was not b'loi davar. He was not some nobody who was living somewhere in a village. He was a big somebody. He was a big Talmud Chacham. He was a Talmud Chacham in the highest caliber in Klal Yisrael at the time. He was a Gadol Hadar caliber Talmud Chacham. But Nervas, and Chazal don't blame Tziva for this. Tziva probably was afraid that David Melech wanted to harm whoever was left over from Shaul's house. And in order to cover it up, he didn't want to stoke David Melech's ire, so he just says, he's a nobody, he's not worth your attention. Tzim Saif, once David Melech took the time to bring him into the loop and to bring him to David Melech's court, of course David Melech understood that he was a big person. There's no hard feelings on Tziva on this. It says then the pasuk continues on, a parak later, and says, Vayhi acharei Kain. It was after this. Now Rabbi Yaakov makes an important diak. He says Vayhi Acharei Kain implies that these two things are connected to each other. These two stories are connected to each other. But if you look at them at face value, there's zero connection to each other. It says Vayhi Acharei Kain, Vayamas Melech Bnei Ammon, the king of Ammon dies. Vayimlech Chanun Bnei Tachtav. Chanun takes over, and then the pasuk goes into the whole story here and tells us that David Melech sent a messenger to Chanun, the son of Ammon. He sent him a gift. Now Chanun gets a gift from David Melech, and he says, "What's going on over here? David and my father were not friends. They weren't close. So why is David sending me like a coronation gift? Elamai, it's just a pretense, and he's really sending spies into my kingdom." So Chanun takes the messengers that David Melech sends him, and he cuts off half their beards and half of their clothing, and he sends them home half naked and half shaved. A very embarrassing way to send them home. And the pasuk tells us that they get to Gvulas Eretz Yisrael, they're so embarrassed, they go park in some hut in Yericha, right at the edge, and David Melech sends a messenger, and he tells them, "Here's some new clothing, stay here till your beard goes back, and you'll come back when it's not so embarrassing." And they stay there. Now, Chazal, B'chol and Shia point this out, that David Melech seemingly made a mistake over here. There's an Isser to be Darish B'Shleimim of the Melech B'nei Ammon. David Melech shouldn't have sent a gift to B'nei Ammon. And Ad Kedei Kach, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky points out that it's Yitachin, that the Melech Ammon knew this. And he said, "What's going on over here? One second. David Melech's not supposed to be sending me gifts. Because Stam to be Poseach B'Shalom, he's not allowed to do that. A close friend of my father, he wasn't that. They fought with each other all the time. So what's going on over here? Elamai, but less braver. The only thing that's left is he's coming to make some sort of subterfuge. This is a trick." And the pasuk tells us David Melech was furious, obviously, and Ammon realized that they misplayed this, and they go out to battle, and David Melech, wipes out the Bnei Ammon in an incredible way. It tells us how he maps them out and makes mamish bushes v'cherpos, mamish b'zyonis. David Melech destroys them. Then the psukim continue, and in this battle with Bnei Ammon is where the story of Uriah Achiti with his wife Bathsheba happens. Uriah Achiti is out in battle, his wife is home, the whole story with David Melech, and David Melech calls Uriah home from battle. Uriah Melech is married to Malchus. The whole sugya of Kol Yetzel L'Mechamez Beis David get creases Kaisav L'Ishta a few times in Chazal, Gemara in Shabbos, Gemara in Gittin, a whole arichastic sugya that transpires underneath over here, which again seemingly has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on beforehand, but keeps being strung together by Vayhi Acharei Kain. This is the next thing in the episode. Then because of this Aveira, albeit Chazal say Kol Eimer David Chata, the Gemara in Shabbos Daf Nunvav Einei Elataya, so it's not a real Aveira, it's a small Aveira, and the Malbim has a big arichas b'Masber, and the Barbanel is his Mahalach, and there's so much to talk about over here, but let's just wrap this up neatly. Albeit because of this Aveira, whatever you want to call it, David Melech gets an Einish, and Hashem tells Nasan Rav, he comes, gives him the grace of Musa Shmuz, and tells him that Hashem is going to punish him something from his own household. Turns out that thing from his own household is Avshalom. Two things really, but Avshalom becomes a rebel against David Melech. David Melech has to run away, he's on the run. Avshalom takes his kingdom, he takes his wives, etc. And eventually, David Melech comes back, Avshalom loses, and there's the famous psukim of Avshalom B'ni Avshalom, and David Melech cries and rescues his son Avshalom from Gehenna and brings him to Gan Eden, etc. Then when this is all said and done, after this is all said and done, 10 prakim later, in Parak Yotes, in Pasuk Lamed, there's a pasuk like this. It says as follows. It says, Vayomer, Pasuk Chavtes. One second. No. Here. One second. So it says Mephibosheth comes to David, and he's all torn. Mephibosheth ben Shaul, Pasuk Chafei, I'm sorry. Mephibosheth ben Shaul, Yared L'Kras HaMelech, he comes to greet the king. V'le'asa raglav, v'le'asa svamay, v'esbigdei le'kibes, l'minayayim lechas HaMelech adiyem sheba b'shalom. He's totally overgrown. He hasn't trimmed his hair or his mustache or his clothes, washed his clothing or anything from the day David HaMelech went on the run. Vayihiki ba Yerushalayim L'Kras HaMelech, v'yem le'amelech, lama le'alachti Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth, where were you? There was a rebellion going on. Those who were close with me came with me. Where were you? You seem to have been on the other side. And Mephibosheth tells him, Vayomer Adoni HaMelech Avdi Rimani Ki Amar Avdecha. My servant Tziva fooled me, and he told me he'll get me a ride. I missed my ride, and I couldn't come with you. Fine, and he continues, and it says, I have only a karsatayv to you. You've been amazing to me. I have nothing but loyalty to you. Why are you still talking? I said, you and Tziva will split the Yerusha. Now, there's a big turn that happened over here. Originally, David HaMelech told Mephibosheth that the whole Yerusha of Shaul is going to go to him. Now, in the interim, a few psukim ago, Tziva tells David that Mephibosheth is on the other team, and David tells Tziva, you get the whole Yerusha. Now Mephibosheth comes back and says, no, I was here, I was just stuck at home. And David tells, Atat Techalik, you'll split it. Now, on this pasuk, Chazal, the Gemara in Shabbos, and Daf Nun Vav brings a machlekes Rav and Shmuel. Rav says, Kibul David Lashon Hara. Lashon hara, David was mekabel lashon hara about Mephibosheth, that he had been some sort of traitor, and therefore David split the Yerusha. He didn't give it all to Mephibosheth. Shmuel says no, dvarim ani karim. It was just it appeared to David like this that Mephibosheth wasn't happy in his arrival, and therefore he did this. Now, the Gemara, the Chazal also tell us b'shah she'amar David ata v'tziva techalek. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem says, Rechavam v'yiravam techalek es malchuscha. Because you were Makabal Lashon Hara or didn't respect Mephibosheth properly, and you split away his Yerusha and you took the Lashon Hara from Tziva, who told you that Mephibosheth was was disloyal, so your Melucha is going to be split. That's what it says in the Pasuk. That's what it says in Chazal. So it says Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, there's a whole arichas that's going on in the story over here, that if you didn't know Chazal and you didn't have the wide view of Chazal, you wouldn't pick over here, he says. In Parak Test, when it starts off with Tziva coming, right away Tziva lies to David HaMelech. In their first interaction, Tziva lies. David asks Tziva, is there anybody left to Yonasan? Tziva says, yeah, there's some loser in a village somewhere. Nobody you have to worry about. David HaMelech goes, and he later develops a whole relationship with Mephibosheth, and he realizes that he's far from a loser. Right? He's a Gad Ladar. So David HaMelech should have forever known, Rabbi Yaakov says, that Tziva is a sketchy guy. Tziva tells you what he needs to tell you, and he needs to tell it to you. Tziva is not a guy you should trust. And when Tziva shows up, when David HaMelech is on the run, and he tells him, Mephibosheth is a turncoat, he's a traitor, he's on the other team, David HaMelech should have nodded at Tziva and said, I know, I got this, I got the whole thing figured out over here. And when Mephibosheth comes back and he says, I was waiting here, I just didn't have a ride, I'm a cripple, I couldn't leave, and I'm really on Team David the whole time, David HaMelech should have understood and said, yes, no problem, you get all the Yerusha, and Tziva should be put to death. Tziva now has gone from being just an innocuous liar who's trying to protect Yonasan to being a schemer, someone who's trying to get Yonasan killed, trying to get Mephibosheth killed. And David HaMelech should have seen all that, so to speak. And because he didn't, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Rechavam v'yiravam techalek es malchusecha. Your kingdom is going to be split. So Yaakov says, this is just one example. He says you could do hundreds of these examples of how you need to be a Navi to understand Jewish history. To understand Jewish history properly, you need to have this mamish wide out view that Chazal have, where they could say, from the first time Tziva showed up, Vahi Acharei Kain, it's all connected, Vahi Acharei Kain, for 10 prakim of totally unrelated, years and years worth of monumental occurrences in David's life, there's one like Chut Mashuch, it's all connected, it's all one long line that's running through the whole thing of it. It says, and only Chazal, and only a Navi and Chazal with their interpretations could understand this history properly, he says. So he says, of course, knowing history is wichtig and important and etc. But the type of history that we're talking about is this type of history. It's the type of history of being able to understand this Chut Matuch, this, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's plan, the wide-out view of the plan that's happening all the time. So not stam, like if Chaim Moses is bavarning, that there's agendas and problematic things that could be. There's like a whole different worldview of understanding that has to go in to understanding the history of it. Now, Memela, he says, that there's two main yisaidis that a child needs to know to learn history. That is that we are important to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I just want to get you the two things. He says, the main yisaid is Ata b'chatanu mikol ha'amim. Klal Yisrael is important to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're the Am HaNivchor. We're the important. We're the story. We are the story. Everything else is secondary, not the other way around. Not there's a story happening and where do we fit in and what happened here and what did this person do about this and that. We are the story. Figure out how we are the story, and then it's just you have to work the rest of it around. The rest of it's secondary to the fact that we are the story. And the second part he says is I can't find the second part, but I think it's the part that without Chazal's wide-ranging understanding and wide view of the whole story, you're missing all the details. Meaning, unless you could pick up every one of these diukim, you're missing everything. So now, I don't know how he was machriya, the shaila per se, of what the curriculum should be. I don't have the notes of this Torah Masorah convention, but the drasha itself is a very enlightening drasha. Now, the second nakuda, I feel like I'm talking for too long. Okay, it's going to be another few minutes though. I apologize. I want to get to the end over here. The second nakuda is as follows. And this is something that you see in Chazal already, and Rabbi Schwab makes good mention of this very clearly. There's a few quick Gemaras. I'll read Mamish very quickly. The Mishnah in Megillah, in the Chafayim and Aleph, says as follows: Ma'isa Ruva Nikru Lemitargim, Ma'isa Tamar Nikru Mitargim, Ma'isa Egel Rishon Nikru Mitargim, Masheni Nikru Lemitargim, Birchas Kayanim. Mishnah gives us things that are read at the Kriyas HaTorah, and back in the day they did Targum on it, but it's not Mitargim. And the Gemara goes into different reasons, and there's some of them are because they'll be easily misunderstood or they're embarrassing details. Similarly, the Gemara in Shabbos, in the Tzadik Vav, is a very interesting Shabbos. The Gemara says like this: Tzadik Vav and Beis. The Gemara says, Tanar Rabbanon, Mekoshish Zet Slavchad. The Mekoshish in the Midbar, the one who was B'chal Shabbos, it was Slavchad. How do we know this? Because it says Vehi b'nei so Midbar v'yim tzuish, and later on it says Avinu meis Midbar Ma'alahalan Slavchad Afkan Slavchad. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. That's what Rabbi Akiva says. Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir, and this is the line I want to quote. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir says to Rabbi Akiva as follows: He says, Akiva, benkach u benkach hat asel litan esadin. whether you're right or whether you're wrong, you're going to be punished in the end for this. Why? Because if you're correct that the Makashis was really Tzlafchad, the Torah hid it, and you're revealing it. Who asked you to share this information with everybody? The Torah kept it a secret. It says, Vim lav, and if you're wrong, at the Moitzi Laz Aleisi Tzadik. You're being Moitzi Laz on Noisi Tzadik. Now, the Chavetz Chaim Grada in Shmir Saloshet has a whole shmuz, if it's possible to say Lashon Hara about a dead person. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky actually makes a very wichtige diuk. It says at the Moitzi Laz. Moitzi Shemra may be shaykh on a dead person, could be Lashon Hara, is not shaykh. Rabbi Yaakov, and there's too much to talk about this, but Rabbi Yaakov actually, in his son's Hakdama to Making of a Gadol from Rabbi Nassim Kamenetsky, over there he has a whole arichas of Rabbi Yaakov's position about Lashon Hara, about the dead. And he said a quote, Rabbi Yaakov used to say, Gam avasam, gam senasam is already gone. 50 years is enough of time that whatever the politics was, whatever the 2 days is, it's over. And he says Rabbi Yaakov was, okay, I can't get sidetracked with this, I want to finish up the thing. That's a whole nother shmuz. B'chal ofen, it says Nimtzat Moitzi Laz. Now, Rabbi Schwab, in this letter, it's in the collected writings, it was originally in German. It was in the, I can't even read this word, it was in the Mitteilungen in December 1984. It must be German. It must be in German. I don't know. You want to weigh in? No. Okay. But he writes as follows. In this whole arichas, he says how Chazal did not spend a lot of time discussing history, etc. He says there's a vast difference between history and storytelling. History must be truthful. Otherwise, it does not deserve its name. A book of history must report the bad with the good, the ugly, the beautiful, the difficulties, the victories, the guilty, and the virtue. Since it's supposed to be truthful, it cannot spare the righteous if he fails, and it cannot skip the virtues of the villain. For such is truth. All is told the way it happened. Only a Navi, mandated by divine calling, has the ability to report history as it really happened, unbiased and without prejudice, because like we just saw from Yaakov, classic example, but there's many of these, there's so much more in the subtext that's going on over there. And if you read it just at face value, taka, you're making grave mistakes. I mean, you need to read it with the way all the diukim and how Chazal read it. It says, but storytelling, which is what we do, that's our Gedolim books and our stories and etc. Storytelling is to give over a narrative. Storytelling is to I'm trying to find the exact quote. Storytelling, he says, is to give over a narrative and to train the future generation. It's an educational tool. Storytelling is an educational tool that we use to give over to the next generations the narrative and the ideas and the ideals that we think are important. He says history, it's not so wichtig. Because history can be very easily misconstrued. It can be very easily mistaken. You could easily make mistakes. Storytelling is what we're doing. Now, obviously, there are those who criticize this and say it's gone too far, and this is the whole arichas. There's books and articles, and even Baron Feldman in his book Sefer Turbulent, The Eye of the Storm, has a whole arichos how Gedolim books are missing the point and they don't convey. And he's attacking it from the right. There's obviously plenty of who attack it from the left, but that's not today's topic. Maybe when we do a share on the making of a gadol, we'll talk. Maybe we do a share on making gadol, we'll talk about that. That's a separate story. Maybe we should do next week talk about the lashon hara aspect of mesim, gedolim, etc. Now, this was all, I'm sorry, b'teres hakdama to the discussion of Steinsaltz. The delicate balance that is conveying the historical details of previous generations, meaning the fact that history on its own, just telling the truth, does not have a value in Yiddishkeit per se. Just retelling what happened back in the day in the exact true way does not have a value per se. It's the storytelling, it's the narrative building, it's the sharing of ideals that we're looking for. And therefore, when saying over the history of Gedolim, of previous eras, Tanaim, Amiroim, etc., it's a super, super delicate balance. Now, if you look at most of the Kolkairas that were written against the Steinsaltz edition, they're primarily written against the other books that he wrote. And the sidebars, where he goes into like a psychological discussion of Abaya, or he'll write what Rabbi Shmuel's temperament was. You know, Rabbi Shmuel was X, or Rabbi Akiva was X, or whatever. Meaning, it's these type of details that brought down this big pushback from the Gedolim. And due to our limited amount of time, I'm going to read Rav Shach's letter, which is the most shlemistic letter. It's not the only one. There's many, many letters that were written about it. But I want to read Rav Shach's. I'll read it, as much of it as I can. It's a beautiful and very complete discussion of this mamish, what we're talking about. Rav Shach says as follows. He says, Tsar li ma'od. I'm in pain. Ach ki yedei ani mach erchi, aval libi boyer bekirbi. I know I'm not the God Ladar, Rav Shach says, but libi boyer bekirbi says, v'hasheket leyuchal, I can't be quiet. V'ani mucher lichtav dvar ma'yetz min alev. Ala sakana yemedes chas v'shalom l'kakeas yisaydi shel Klal Yisrael. Asher kol amunas am Yisrael banei al zeh. V'hu says this is the main plank of Klal Yisrael's amunah. V'usha atayr shebal peh kedushasa mamish ketayr shebachsav. V'shneim nitnu l'meishem yisinim pi gvur. Atayr shebal peh, atayr shebachsav were given together. V'chal kula tayrihi k'shmei amru begitten samach med beis. He says, V'chol Yehudi shaleimid Gemara b'beis hamedrash b'chever shas shaya nimtza b'chol ir ve'ir. Every simple Jew who's learning Gemara on whatever level he was, wherever he was, yada shaleimid Torah shenitten l'moshe misinai. He understood and he knew deep down that he was learning the Torah that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu. V'tanam v'hameroim k'malachi asharis. And the Tanam and Ameroim were like malachim. Shanu yoidim u'maminim sha'katan shebehem ha'yibiyacholti l'hachiyas mesim. We know and we believe that even the smallest amongst them was able to be mechayim mesim. V'anachnu yasmi d'yasmi b'dar shafilu k'chamer shel pinchas ben yor le'daminu. Dar sh'ashtika yafalei. We're a dar that quiet suits us well. V'chas v'shalom af echad le'heiz lahatul kol bikaris kolshu lachar chasimus al-talmud they're Ravina Ravashi. No one would chas v'shalom breathe a word of bikaris on anyone after the chasimus al-talmud or Ravina Ravashi. And he says this idea that the Torah was Kaddish was he hagayrim hayechidi l'kiyim klal Yisrael me'az hayalanu b'maimed arsina. This is the main thing, the only thing that kept Klal Yisrael, sustained Klal Yisrael, kept Klal Yisrael alive throughout the days. U'makoyev halev liris kibalas hakadosh me'echad ha'mischakim be'etzem ba'atzasa yetzer lichtav pirush l'gemara nikim shem atamon amvor v'amenuket. He says, and it pains me to see this pirush that was written by someone who's a mischakim, who wants to be wise, who's trying to be wise, who's including all biurim shaynim to make it easier to learn. And when one learns this, it removes any zik of kedusha, any tiny remnant of kedusha and emunah from the limud. We're not going to learn. He says we're going to have less learning. He says this is a major line. Rashach says our job is to be shomer the pach shem, and I don't, so to speak, I don't care if nobody else learns. That's what Rashach saying. I don't care. I actually heard from someone who was involved when the art school thing was going on, and they told Rashach that 50,000 people have learned. It's not my problem. I don't care. It's mamish in his own hand. He says, I don't care. It's our job to be showing me the tiny pach shemen that is v'leil ariba ye'enei tar. Not to be marbe many who aren't tar. And the few that learn properly and that get a real kinyan with your shemayim in the proper way, they'll already spread to everybody else. He says, I didn't know anything about this. This is where the punchline is. Every one of them is the same. When I saw some of the rest of his writings, dugma sefer ishim b'mikra, like personalities from the mikra, the nashim b'mikra, the women of the mikra. I was shaken. Believe shalom sheyesh b'm divrei minas v'apikarsis v'chilul kvei datayra. Umeiz ledaber bezilzul neira ala avos hakdoshim atanon v'amiroim. Asher ein lanu klal tfisa begaydol madrigusim v'asagasam. The way he talks and the way he humanizes them and trivializes them and describes them in regular modern terms, like regular people, brings them down from this level of kedusha that we need to learn Torah, and it makes everything kol zik shebekdusha is gone. V'tzar li moich and itzarach lizik aval ledaiti svar tzrichen geniza v'asalomud la'ayim b'm lachnisim l'beis medrash. Ledaiti says his svarim, all of his svarim need geniza, and you're not allowed to bring them into beis medrash. Now, Rashach is the most poetic and beautiful and really like heart-wrenching version of it, but there's many chuvas from all the Gedolei Yisrael in the time who wrote this, and they all are writing the same thing. The Shas itself, the translation itself, was not really the shmuz. The shmuz was the trivialization and the diminishing the pedestal that we put Chazal and the Chachmei Yisrael and the Gedolei Man b'chol dar v'dar, diminishing them by humanizing them, by trivializing them, by bringing them down. So it was really, to wrap it up, it's taking all these different elements that Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky and Rabbi Chaim Meiser and etc. that we discussed about how delicate and cautious one needs to be when describing the Gedolei Yisrael from previous generations, and Kavachemer, B'Menashe Kavachemer, the Chachmei Talmud, the Amiram, the Tanaim, the Avis, etc. That was when they showed snippets, and there's a longer article here I printed out from the Israeli Ated, like exactly some of the snippets, and if we had time I would go into it, but suffice to say, that is the underlying critique. The rest of it, the Shini of the Tzur Sadaf, moving Rashi aside, taking Taisvis aside, translation, the Aaron Feldman has comma mistakes, and etc. That's secondary to this main punchline of how cautious and careful we need to be not to humanize and trivialize the Gedolei Yisrael. Just I'll end off with this. There was, I forgot where I saw it, but the Beis Halevi, when he would learn, the Beis Halevi, every time we learn, he'd say, Amar Abaye is, hat the Heilige Abaye gesagt, Amar Rava, hat the Heilige Rava gefragt. Every single time he was makvat Seheli, because he says when you're learning Gemara, befrat when you're learning Lamdis, which the Beis Halevi is from the earliest, modern Lamdanim, befrat when you're learning Lamdis, it's very easy to forget that you're handling the Heilige Abaye, the Heilige Rava. It becomes a whole mental calisthenics. It's it's a whole thing for itself. It's a whole way of learning, a whole way of thinking, a way of talking and acting and thinking, etc. It's easy to forget what Rav Shach's talking about. So the Beis Halevi was so makbid to be Nizr, like even when he was learning, every single time, they said he would say, hey, I saw from Moshe Shtamrach. Moshe Shtamrach says it over here from Briskurav. Briskurav told Moshe Shtamrach, the Beis Halevi was makbid on this. Anyhow, this was the underlying critique of the Steinsaltz Shas. Perhaps next week we'll do Lashon Hara on Mesim as an addendum to this. Maybe not. To be continued. We'll see.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.